Good evening, everybody. Welcome. My name is Jay Miles. You are tuning into the studios of East Haven Public Television in conjunction, for the first time ever, with Connecticut News Junkie. We're super excited to bring you an important conversation on the perils of YouTube journalism. I'm sure you didn't tune in this evening or come all the way to join us in person to just listen to me, however. So in addition to myself, I'm bringing two very special guests to the stage in a minute. As you may or may not know, East Haven Public Television is the public access station here in East Haven, but we're much more than that. We bring to the general New Haven region an open mic every month, film screenings, artists performing live music. We have our big Great Give Telethon coming up on May 6th. And now, for the first time ever, thanks to our partners at Connecticut News Junkie, an important conversation we're calling Discussions in Digital. I'm the board chair here at East Haven Public Television, and I'm a recovering journalist and published author when people still read books. You may have heard of mine. But to really round out the conversation about this important topic, I want to welcome our two guests, the first of which is currently a columnist with Connecticut News Junkie, a gentleman who spent 34 years teaching high school English right here in Connecticut and has enjoyed his 20th season coaching football at the high school level and still teaching, including this evening before he came here, English courses at the Middlesex campus of the Connecticut State Community College System. Please welcome Barth Keck to the stage. Hey, sir.
Hi, Jay.
Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having me.
In addition to that, we have a reporter and journalist from the Valley Independent Sentinel, a graduate of a pretty decent liberal arts college in downtown New Haven called Yale University, where they were involved with the Yale Review and then spent 3 years in various editorial roles with the New Journal. Please give me a big welcome for Jasmine Wright. Hi, Jasmine.
Hello.
Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you for having us.
So, by way of just kind of kicking this off, I was doing what I often do, which is drinking too much coffee and sitting at home waiting for a video job to come along. And I read Barth's article, which we're going to get into a little bit later on. And I just thought we've got to start tackling this YouTube journalist phenomenon. So I'm wondering, just to kind of kick things off, Barth, can you tell us what your entry point was into writing the article in the first place? And then I'd love to get your take on that whole scenario in Minnesota and how that went on and what your perspective might have been.
Well, my starting point was reading about Nick Shirley, who is a self-titled YouTube independent journalist, and what he did in Minnesota, which was to go there with his smartphone and film himself knocking on doors of daycare centers and creating ultimately a 40-minute video, which got 3 million views or thereabouts, was put up on YouTube at the end of December. And before we knew it, there was all kinds of publicity about what was going on, and to the point where the Trump administration immediately withheld funds and decided it was going to engage in an investigation.
From the daycare centers.
Exactly.
Right.
From the daycare centers, and was going to engage in an investigation. And this all came about because of Nick Shirley's video on YouTube as a journalist. And it kind of piqued my interest because I kind of knew, I didn't know a lot about it, but I knew that there had been investigations years before about it. It wasn't like he was uncovering anything that hadn't been uncovered before, but what it did was it gained much more publicity nationwide. And so I just wanted to kind of compare, what had been done before, how journalism had been conducted in the past, and what his techniques were in producing this video, and try to see, is this really a legitimate phenomenon, this so-called independent YouTube journalism? And so I wrote the column.
And do you, Jasmine, remember kind of when that whole, calling it a story is a little strong, but when that broke, did you have a take on it? Did you have a perspective on it? Were you caught off guard by it? Were you not caught off guard?
So my immediate response when the Nick Shirley video dropped was, I did not initially think that much of it because it wasn't a news story, and I wasn't tapped into, that side of YouTube specifically, because, and I think we'll come back to this later, but if you go back several years, this had been national headlines before. In 2022, there was an FBI operation that indicted a large number of people in Minnesota specifically for things related to this and pandemic relief, so on and so forth.
Right.
So it wasn't on my radar right away that this was, the conversation has shifted. But then I think we saw pretty quickly as you said, the Trump administration had acted on the video and the claims that it made, and Nick Shirley's, if you want to call it reporting, acted on those very quickly. And so there were a lot of material differences that came out of it. I don't think I really had a full, appreciation of the impact of that video until actually I was invited to this panel, and then I sat down and I read your article. And I think that really, I thought it was a great article that really sort of showed why this is different than what had happened before. As you said, this has been reported for a decade prior with different methods. And then this video comes around, there's very swift action coming out of it with just, it's a very different presentation style, and not what I was used to as someone who grew up, trying to mostly read print media.
Yeah. Impact is the word you used that stuck out to me there, because you didn't say news, you didn't say breaking news, you didn't say reported by, it didn't come from CNN, didn't come from Fox, right? But it did have impact along a bunch of different wavelengths, if you will. I don't think that's anything that any of us would deny. I think it does beg the question, our first question that we wanted to talk about is where people are getting what they are calling news, right? And I wonder if you could talk about some of the preferred sources that you maybe have seen, or personally, I try to spread my news gathering, my morning with my coffee usually starts on Blue Sky, and then I might follow, whether it's the BBC or whatever, depending on what interests me or what has impact that morning outside of current events. Where do you think people are going for their news sources right now?
Well, if you look at what the Pew Research Center has done very recently, essentially more than 50%, 56% of people say they get their news or some of their news digitally. So that means they get it off their phones, they get it off tablets, they get it off their laptops, which isn't surprising. 36% actually go to YouTube first, according to most recent research late last year by Pew Research Center. So we've seen this dramatic shift, and especially among younger generations, to go to the digital platforms. And that's where they get their news predominantly. If you're looking at a third of the population, of the overall population, going to YouTube. So I think that the issue here is that, like you said, like you like to spread out your sources, and I do as well. I call it, kind of varying my algorithm, because, and I think we'll get into this as well,
Yeah.
is if all I do is stick to one or two sources that are, politically motivated in one direction or the other, then my algorithm is going to feed me more and more of those types of stories and those types of sources. And
Sure.
so I'm going to get stuck down that silo of those sources. And unfortunately, a lot of these sources, as we said, they're digital, they're video. You made the joke about people that read anymore. Unfortunately, when Nick Shirley goes around with a smartphone, there's not a lot of reading and research that's going into the reporting ahead of time. And so that's one of the key issues, is this vast shift towards digital.
Yeah, and if I could just throw on to that, I mean, I think my idealized version of myself, I have my preferred journalistic sources that I trust for sort of national and international news. It's when I'm at my best, I'm reading the Associated Press and NPR, and I'm feeling really good about myself. But that's not the first thing I see in the morning when I wake up. The first thing I see in the morning when I wake up is whatever the Instagram algorithm has decided to feed to me. And I think
Right.
that's,
Yep.
and I work in this field, and that's still what I see first. As a general rule, as a local reporter, I don't follow any, political accounts or anything of that nature. Nonetheless, because I have friends who follow certain
Right.
political accounts, the algorithm has decided I need to know a whole lot about what the Zoran Mamdani administration is doing in New York. So Instagram tells me a whole lot
Right.
about New York local news, even though it's, I'm not actively seeking it out. So there is this active versus passive consumption of news. We're getting the passive version either way, as long as we're on social media. We're social creatures. The algorithm is, So I think there's an extent to which we can control what we take in, but there is also just a degree to which we have to kind of recognize we're going to get some of this, and we need to filter how much we trust it accordingly.
It's interesting you word it that way. I like to use Facebook to see what's going on in New Haven, and if there's friends of mine playing a show or something, and I always have to reset because it thinks I live in Manhattan, because occasionally I go and work in Manhattan, or I go to the city to see a show or a ball game or something. It's kind of maddening the way the tech stuff determines one of the notes I wrote as we were all preparing was that we all, instead of being in a demographic that used to, sort of mean age or location, we're all sort of in these little silos now, right? And depending on how the algorithm is barking at us that morning or what we needed to shop for the night before, we could have a different view of the world the next morning. So what's your take on that in terms of demographics and how news reaches us? It's so different than it used to be.
Well, I think Jasmine made the point that news consumers now are much more passive than they ever were because they're fed the news, but they're fed through these algorithms, as opposed to in the past where you had to make an active decision that I'm going to subscribe to the newspaper and I'm going to read the newspaper and I'm going to page through it and pick out the articles that I want to read. It's not going to be just served up to me on for me, it's my email, my Yahoo homepage is my email. I get all kinds of stories that are filtered that way, and
Right.
it's just not. It's just passive. It's not active. I'm not actively seeking the news, and I think that shifted the whole paradigm of what it means to be a news consumer now. It's just this idea that I can just wait and the news is going to rain down on me, as opposed to I've got to go seek it, and consequently, people don't have the skills that they might have had at one time to be media literate and know when to. How to be able to differentiate fact from opinion, first of all, and fact from false news.
Right.
So it's that passivity, I think, that's really it's what is a major issue now.
And I absolutely agree with you that we are more passive as news consumers as a whole than we've ever been before. And I don't think it's an entirely new phenomenon either. I think passive consumption of the news has existed for a while, and I think it's been a gradually it's been expanding in its share. Like if you go back to when I was growing up, like passive consumption of the news very much existed then because, if you go out to a restaurant, you have TV news blaring in the background and maybe it's two pundits arguing with each other.
Right.
And so I'm not really making any active effort to take that in, but I'm still taking in some part of it.
Right.
And that's obviously, it's different when it's muted and in an airport or something, but I agree with your ultimate point that we're consuming it more passively than we have been before, and that's probably not great for our critical thinking.
Key point: critical thinking.
Yeah, I'm sure that could be its own episode. I'm sure we'll get back to it a little bit. We talked a little bit in our prep about legacy media dying off. They haven't done themselves many favors. And to be fair, legacy media, while it had its place and you could rely on the New York Times or the Washington Post or whatever massive gray dinosaur legacy media you want to refer to, that they were probably not lying. There may have been some skewing one direction or another, but you pretty much could rely on the fact that whether it was AP or But we've seen these instances, the New York Times plagiarism problem, the collapse of CBS, the Bezosification of the Washington Post.
Right.
It's an ugly time. So you can't blame people necessarily for going to other places. And that collapse, I think, fuels this as well. I wonder if you have any thoughts on that part of it.
I think one of the key issues here is that of gatekeeping. And what we see with a lot of the new media, like the YouTube journalist, is there is no editor, there is no person that is reviewing the story, checking the facts before the story goes out. Whereas, with the legacy media, at least traditionally, there was the whole newsroom setup where you had not just like you had section editors, you had the editor-in-chief, you had managing editors that were, I mean, maybe it was too top-heavy, but at least that they were the gatekeepers for the content that went out before it went out, and to make sure that it was as factual as possible. Nowadays, you don't have as much of that. Now, I think what has happened is you've got newspapers that have had to go digital, and they also have to attract viewers. And in doing that, that gatekeeping function has maybe lost its traction, and you have a lot more people who are interested in, the whole A/B headline testing, where we're going to put the same story out under two different headlines and test out to see which gets more clicks. I mean, that's very basic, but still it shows you that even newspaper websites, which traditionally were, legacy media, when they were print newspapers, they also have to start playing that digital game of trying to attract as many clicks as possible. And so the gatekeeping function is not as much gatekeeping as it is, I'm a shepherd. I need to gather more people here to my content, to my website.
Right, right.
And I think it's funny that you use that word, because I feel like the way I grew up, gatekeeping was almost exclusively a bad word. It's like even when you said it just now, I had to kind of, it took me a second to sort of follow what you were saying, just because that has such that association is baked so deep into my brain. But it's true, like that is a function, and that's what allowed us to have some sort of consensus of what is true and what isn't, is knowing that it did go through these gates, it went through this process, it was fact-checked, and and there's a million different angles to sort of come at this. Like, when you're adapting to the digital era, some of those get sacrificed because you do need to bring more people in, but there's also, there's a part of it where private equity just bought up a bunch of newspapers, and then there isn't the staff to do the gatekeeping because they got gutted.
Exactly.
So it's, but and it's...
And to be truthful, legacy media had its problems. You mentioned that, and you can go all the way back to the late '60s and Spiro Agnew, who was complaining about the East Coast Ivy League media elite who owned the newspapers, and they were also, they were gatekeepers as well, and there were stories that probably never got told as a result of. I don't want to say that. I mean, that's a stereotype. I think that newspapers in general, the major dailies, were a little bit more open than that, but still. You have to, the legacy media had its problems as well. So, but it's the whole paradigm has shifted.
And I don't want to turn this into like just harshing on YouTubers. We certainly are spoiled in some respects. We were talking right before the start of the show about the Artemis moon mission and how we had all this incredible access. And you could make the same argument for something that's not NASA, where they have tons of resources, where there literally is a person with a camera who does break a story or does bring a particular perspective or voice that would not have ever stood a chance. Not even so much because of gatekeeping, but just because of column inches or the limits of the half-hour evening news. There's only so much that you can get into each of those formats. Right. So we don't want to harsh on that idea, but there is a sort of fact versus false, news versus algorithm struggle that you both have sort of hinted at. How do we navigate all that collectively where we're not just reacting to, oh my God, this thing, and it's a lot of clickbaity kind of stuff that's designed, as you hinted at, to gather and shepherd in the most eyeballs?
For me, the answer is always media literacy. I mean, I taught media literacy for 30 years at the public school level. In high school, it was a standalone class. And making people legitimate, critically thinking news consumers. And media literacy, I think, is the key. The problem with that is that it is so, every day things get more complicated. And I think that it's hard to keep up with a lot of the media literate kind of techniques that are needed in order to be able to wade through all of this. And it's as simple as deciding on, what is a news story versus what is a news analysis versus what is an op-ed versus what is long-form journalism.
And they all look the same in a lot of cases.
And I mean, there was a time when things were labeled, I love newspapers. I'm an old guy. I go back to where you would have the news section, and you would have the metro section or the local section, and you would have the sports, and you'd have the opinions, the op-eds, and it was delineated so that it was
you
labeled.
understood the territory you were reading in.
And even newspapers were structured that way. They still are, the traditional ones, where there is a news department which is separate from the editorial department, from the opinions department. But nowadays, there's so much content. It's hard to differentiate between this is news, this is opinion, and if people don't have those critical thinking skills to differentiate to begin with, then I got to the point in my career where I'm thinking, am I just beating a dead horse? Have I passed a tipping point? Is media literacy now not even going to work?
Well, the new definition of legitimate is not so much like who's the writer, who's the editor, what's the reputation of the paper or the radio station or the web, it's, they have a really beautiful set and they have that microphone that everyone has to have now. That means they're a legitimate journalist.
Yeah.
And that's the threshold.
And I mean, I think on that idea of media literacy, this is basically rewording what you just said, but I think a really helpful skill is just being able to name what you're looking at, name what you're consuming. Because there are YouTubers that I watch who I think are brilliant video essayists. They can put together a really wonderful presentation with a lot of analysis there. There are Substacks that I read where I think some people have really wonderful analysis of music culture or this or that. And those aren't necessarily going through teams of editors. It's a Substack blog. That person is a blogger and an analyst, and they're providing that type of content. And journalists, whenever you are doing journalism, you are creating another kind of content. And I think we've just kind of conflated, well, I say we, it's a very royal we. The algorithm really has conflated all of these things into, you can call yourself whatever you want your job to be, whatever sounds the most, respectable, but there are different functions for each of these, and there are different levels of skepticism that we as viewers should apply to each of these.
That's a great point. And I think when we use the term YouTube journalist, there's a lot of YouTube journalists out there that give themselves that name, but they're providing all kinds of different content. And so,
there's a huge spectrum of value and legitimacy and entertainment aspect and engagement that it goes the whole spectrum from super valid and informative and vocal to just sloppy,
in my class,
clickbaity likes and shares.
I would use YouTube videos in my class. Of course, I'm screening them. I think I'm trained to know what's legit and what's not. But there's good information out there.
Sure.
But it gets back to that point of, do consumers have the ability to screen the good and the factual from the false and the opinionated, the biased.
And the immediate, which brings us to Mr. Shirley and the Somali daycare situation. So I'm hoping we can take a few minutes and just establish for folks a little bit of the, I guess, shared, understood timeline. There were Somali daycare centers in Minnesota. We know that the case was explored years before Shirley got on the scene. And then he got on the scene to break the story. Maybe I'll start, Barth, with you about how that sequence sort of played out.
Right.
And then we can talk about methods.
He went to Minnesota late last year, and the very last week of December of 2025, he uploaded his video, and you saw him going around and saying that I have a son, can you take him in? And showing his smartphone video of empty rooms that were supposedly daycares. And anyway, this comes out at the end of last year, 40 minutes of his breaking story. And within a month, that's when the investigations from the federal government began, and the money stopped, at least temporarily, like the Medicaid money that went to these daycares. That was the end of last year, the very beginning of this year, 2026. Go all the way back to 2013, and there were stories that had been broken by the legacy media, by the Minnesota Star Tribune, by Minnesota Public Radio, and by a local television station, beginning in 2013 and 2015, and you mentioned the investigation in 2022. So this was not really a breaking story. This was something that had been known for years. It's just that it was Nick Shirley and the popularity of YouTube and also the fact that we had some very important influencers out there, including those who are on Twitter, who work in the federal government, that made this explode. So why wasn't this a bigger story 10 years before when it was first reported? It's because we now live in a digital world where these things, they do explode.
Methods we talked about in our preparation. Maybe, Jasmine, you can talk a little bit about how, I mean, listen, the cameras are cheap now. You know, you can edit your own stuff. You can digitize your own backgrounds. It's easy to do green screen work now. So there's a lot of methods that allow for folks to feel, whether or not it's justified or whether or not it's to the right ends, a sense of empowerment. Can you talk about some of those methods that you've seen from these kind of journalists?
Yeah, and I mean, sticking with the example of the Nick Shirley video, you had mentioned, you know, he rolled up to this daycare center and said, I want to enroll my son, Joey. Doesn't have a son named Joey, but he's teamed up with this other guy named David, who's been conducting his own investigation, his own independent investigation of these centers. And later we find out David is a political activist. And Joey doesn't exist. And also they went to this daycare center outside of operating hours and found empty rooms when the building was closed, which is
I'm taking notes on all of this, by the way. Fake son named Joey, go after hours, work with a
and so all of these, they're just like, okay, if we start with the hours and the closed rooms, it's very strange to me as a reporter that his first instinct would be to go there outside of working hours. It's my first instinct, if I wanted to find out if a place was operating or not, I would go there during their open hours, most likely.
I think I follow you.
Exactly. Because if I'm looking for things that are, if I'm looking to find out if someone is operating as they say they're operating, I'm at least going to give them a chance.
Step one
exactly. And it's, you know, the whole pretending that he has a son named Joey, I imagine, is entertaining for the purposes of a YouTube video. It provides a sort of, I don't know,
it goes right to the heartstrings.
Exactly,
you know?
Exactly.
I mean, I want the best for my son, who's totally imaginary and made up.
Right. But the way I would probably introduce myself in that situation is I would say, hi, my name is Jasmine Wright. I'm a reporter. I have some questions. And that's, you know, that's sort of, there are codes of ethics that reporters follow where generally we try to be very transparent in our methods. We try to be very honest in our methods. And I think this is something that a lot of these, you know, the citizen journalists, YouTube journalists sort of don't, I think there's, I'm going to back a lot of this up. I think there's a very glamorous image of journalism as this like espionage-like operation where you are deep undercover. Exactly. And that's sort of, it's a very glamorous image of what journalism is like. And I think that
there's a long history of it, actually. Yeah. I saw a thing last night on YouTube, of course, about the Sunday Times in London and how many spies they had working there. Like, it's not an outrageous clickbaity thing to say that there's this interesting crossover of like asking questions and sticking your nose in places, like all of which I think you could say is valid until you just go with the kid and he's got a cell phone and he just barges in at 6:30 at night or whenever it was with his imaginary son.
Right,
It gets weird.
That aspect definitely exists, but it's sort of like, you know, that allows you to learn things you wouldn't be able to otherwise learn. And I just, seeing the methods that were used here, I wasn't convinced that he couldn't have learned more pertinent, more useful information by using more transparent methods.
What stuff that you might want to add to that? I saw you nodding a lot.
Well, yeah, I think that the difference is that number one, if you have those, if you're working for an organization and you employ or work with these investigators, or you have investigative reporters, again, you still have an editor who is
Sure.
checking your work, and before anything gets published or put up online. Nick Shirley goes out and he's got nobody. Nobody is telling him that, well, you can't do that. And you mentioned code of ethics. It's a lot of that goes back to training, and what type of repertorial training, journalistic training, did Nick Shirley have? None whatsoever. I mean, he had no experience whatsoever in things like, I need to go to town hall to find some public records, or I need to go to, I need to, find other sources and actually talk to people face to face. Traditional, shoe leather reporting. I used to have a saying when I taught journalism in high school. It's, you have to get off your arse. It's like, it's called Goya reporting, Goya, get off your arse. Because you can't just sit there and hope that everything's going to fall your way, or it's just like the old-fashioned shoe leather reporting that's missing.
And also, you can't just take the number of likes and shares and comments and subscribers and all the other little, social media types of accolades and consider that proper or successful or legitimizing if you're talking about imaginary children. Right?
Well, and the interesting thing about Nick Shirley's case is he had over 3 million views for this, but I was talking to Jasmine about this before. It's like YouTube measures its views by somebody who watches at least 30 consecutive seconds of a video. He had a 42-minute video. If you watched it for 32 seconds, that was one view. So how many of those 3 million viewers actually watched even 5 minutes of it?
Well,
we don't know.
And to me, the other dangerous part of this is the water cooler next day at work, that famous cliche. You're talking to people that you know the next day. Well, I watched it. I saw it. Right. No, I saw it. It was totally legit. He talked to this woman, and this thing happened. And which 30 seconds did you watch? And I also think there's a part of this that is important to speak to, and it's a little unfair maybe because it's just a bit of wordplay. You've mentioned a couple of times, well, these folks, these YouTube journalists, they don't have editors. And I think there's a portion of the audience who's going to say, well, he does his own editing. Because they're thinking about manipulating video and that definition of editing. But we're not talking about, from a journalistic standpoint, somebody looking over the piece and helping to shape and guide it. And I think that misconception gets the waters even murkier than they already are. So that brings me to rigor and sort of journalistic rigor, which, again, YouTube's not going to insist on it, right? There's no overarching legacy media style editorial staff who's going to insist upon any kind of rigor. So with journalists like Shirley and co. Completing all these kind of projects, how do we get more of that rigor into the system? Is it possible, or is it just we have to beat the algorithm by not watching and starve the fire by not providing it any oxygen?
I would advocate for...
It's a tough one. It's a tough one.
Yeah, I would advocate for full systemic change and putting media literacy classes in every single school.
Thanks for tuning in. Smash the state.
Found the solution.
Well, to your point, it's I have written more than one, probably dozens of articles that makes the case for media literacy graduation requirements. Making sure that when we graduate students from high school, that they are critical thinkers, that they can be able to navigate the digital landscape with at least some modicum of understanding, what's going on, and what, can I differentiate fact from opinion? And although again, I think that we live in a world that's even the media literacy. There's kids would take my class, and by the end of the year, I'm like, it's like, did they learn anything? They are inundated with so much content.
Right.
It's an avalanche. It's very hard to, try to work your way through that.
I liked what you said earlier about naming what it is you're consuming. Even if you could just identify it at a bare bones level.
Right.
Oh, this guy does this. Right. Oh, this is ESPN, okay, or this is the BBC. But maybe that's the answer?
Yeah, I mean, that's a lot of what media literacy is, because it's, I enjoy reading the news. It's what I do for a living. It would really be a shame if I didn't enjoy it at least a little bit. I would go insane if it was the only type of media I consumed. I have to balance it with other things, but I do try to be very conscious of what it is I'm looking at and what, a person's motives might be. And it's because, again, this is another thing that the algorithm isn't going to tell you. I think sort of among the public, there was a general consensus throughout the early 2000s where a lot of what you were hearing when you had the TV pundits going back and forth and you were getting that sort of media, it was difficult to, even then the lines were blurry. What is a pundit? What is an analyst? What is a reporter? They were blurred then, and that was with a mostly functioning FCC and 80 years of regulations on the cable networks.
Right.
Now we live in an era where social media algorithms are loosely regulated, if regulated at all, and the regulations mostly seem to come from the EU, which is across the ocean. And so it's just uncharted waters in a lot of ways. And so I think it's like, I don't know what's the starting point, because I think that is the skill to sort of reach for. And
I was kind of getting my head around earlier today, meeting with both of you and how we were going to tackle this. And as I was preparing, I was thinking, this really just comes back to education. Mm-hmm. It comes back to education, and I don't mean education even necessarily in a formal sense, but in a understanding of what it is we're consuming and why we're drawn to it. This goes back to your point, Jasmine, about naming it. And it's a scary time because there's somebody running what's left of the Department of Education who's a former wrestling executive. So, I don't know if that's going to be the immediate answer either.
Well, education, 34 years in public education, and I can tell you that public schools are asked to do a lot of things.
Sure.
And media literacy is just one more thing on the pile. It's just a matter of, what gets the precedence, what gets the political clout, and it's hard. I was always one. Of course, I'm going to say, well, media literacy, that's like critical thinking. That's the basic. That should be the most important thing now.
Right.
And then you throw into the mix the fact that we have, every child now gets a smartphone by the time maybe they're 10 years old, 12 years old, in middle school anyway, on the average, and they're inundated with the content. How do they make hay with all of the stuff that's on their phone? And again, regulation of the platforms. There's all kinds of legislation that is definitely more helping the platforms than it is the consumers.
Yeah, it's a tough time for that too.
Right.
Yeah.
So it's so multi-layered. It's like I don't know where you begin.
I think naming what you're consuming is sort of the first step, and I think a step beyond that is, once you know what you're looking at, consume it skeptically. I like everything I read it as, I try to read it like an editor, even if it's,
polished and
exactly.
And
if I'm reading the Associated Press, sometimes I'll see a story and I'm like, why are you assuming that?
Yeah.
I like to look out for typos. It's a lot of fun, and I think it's a good exercise that benefits everyone. And I think you should do that whenever you're consuming any sort of media. It is a very active form of consumption. It turns your brain on, but it's a fun exercise for me, and I think our whole set of guidelines and ethics are set up to present to a skeptical public, and I think the public is healthiest when it is skeptical. And so, if anyone from Mansonia is watching, when you're reading my articles, read them skeptically.
Yeah.
If I'm saying something and you don't know how I got that information, call that out, because I should be citing my sources. And that's sort of, it's it's all a social contract. It's
Right,
we have a lot of
right.
things that we need to do, and it's a skeptical reader can really help us
Right.
meet those.
That's-
We need to be doing that, and viewers and readers need to be doing that as well.
Right. Well, that's the foundation of media literacy. It really is the skepticism, the critical thinking. It's, you know, there are all kinds of techniques that I teach when it comes to, like, the unit we talk about becoming a news consumer, becoming a media literate news consumer, and that is, yes, go into it with a skeptical eye. But what does that mean? And do what's called read other sources.
Right.
If you want, don't just say I'm going to go to this source and read about this story here. Like, go to other sources. Be able to know which sources are more reliable. Know the fact-checked websites that are available out there, and apply all of those techniques to what you read. The problem is that takes a lot of effort.
Yeah, right. Yeah.
And when you are consuming video, it's I think a lot of that just kind of gets lost in the wash.
Yeah.
So it's a constant struggle.
With that, I think we'll wrap it up. I want to thank Jasmine and Barth for being here. I want to thank our friends out in cyberspace who are watching, the folks who came to spend some time with us here. Thanks to Connecticut News Junkie for partnering with us on what we hope will be a fine series going forward. To everyone here at ETV, thank you for all of your hard work, and we will see you next time. Good night and good luck. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Appreciate it.
Thanks, Jay.
Thanks, buddy. Appreciate you.
Yeah.